The void smelled of old stars and forgotten vows, a silence so thick even echoes hesitated to cross it. Legends have small throats and wide mouths. The legend of Gorr began in the smallness of suffering and the widening of vengeance. He was born where gods were absent and promises were hollow, a creature who learned the taste of being overlooked and the calculus of resentment. Darkseid was the opposite, an idea muzzled into a body, a tract of inevitability that marched planets into submission without haste. Between them lay the arteries of universes, and in those arteries the question had matured for aeons. What right has a god to be a god? Gorr answered that question with knives and silence. Darkseid answered with lore and the Omega. They were not merely beings, each was an argument. Gorr's argument was that divinity, untested and unpunished, becomes a parasite. Darkseid's argument was colder. The cosmos requires structure, and when structure is replaced by chaos, annihilation is mercy. Here, at the seams between galaxies, their orbits converged into a single terrible point. The air, where air might be, quivered as if reality were summoning a witness. Word had traveled in strange ways. Whispers of a God Butcher whose blade drank the stars, and of a tyrant whose eyes cut through destiny itself, braided together into a tapestry of dread. Planets half-lived in the shadow of Apokolips, tuned like instruments to the frequencies of the impending collision, and even lesser gods who hid in corners of myth felt an old premonitory tightening in their throats. Gorr moved through void and shadow with a pilgrim's certainty, all black, the Necrosword, wrapping his arm like a covenant. It was not just a weapon but a surgeon's mirror, reflecting the hollowness he sought to excise. Darkseid descended in silence, not as a storm but as the end of weather. When his feet touched an orbit, the light around it obeyed his geometry. His presence rearranged scale, mountains shrank and suns dimmed into ornaments on his mantle. They did not speak in the beginning, they measured. The first words between them were the economy of force and the grammar of intention. Gorr's blade hummed with the memory of extinguished altars. Darkseid's gaze considered the blade an insect whose existence might be permitted or terminated. In the long prelude their philosophies braided and strained. Gorr's memoirs of godless childhood fed a philosophy rooted in accountability. Gods must be made to answer. Darkseid's treatises, writ in iron and famine, declared that unchecked compassion and arbitrary divinity led inevitably to chaos. His solution had always been the same: order through dominance. The debate moved beyond slogans into the theater of consequence. If Gorr succeeded in slaughtering gods, what would follow? A universe unmoored might fracture into 1,000 freedoms, each cutting its own throat. If Darkseid enforced absolute order, what of the sparks of rebellion and the small miracles that flourished in loopholes? There was no easy answer. Philosophers, mortal, godlike, and machine, sensed the stakes. A child on a ruined moon asked that ancient, ridiculous question: who judges the judge? It was as if the cosmos itself demanded a jury. Gorr's eyes held the terrible poetry of accumulated grudge. He had seen gods preen and pass by the suffering of their worshippers. He had learned to believe that divinity without consequence was only a cruelty with better lighting. Darkseid's eyes, by contrast, were absence given a shape. He did not see individuals so much as the vector of systems. Judgment for him was physics, mercy a perturbation. As primed as their minds were, it remained a contest of will. Each enriched his arsenal with meaning. Gorr's blade was not merely a murder tool, it was an indictment. Darkseid's Omega Effect was not merely a weapon, it was jurisprudence turned kinetic. Their forces were comparable only when one transmuted philosophy into violence. The meeting ground became a wound in space where time held its breath. Stars leaned in. On a fringe world, a small priest bit his lip and prayed for neither. He prayed only that whatever came would end the pretense of cosmic indifference. This was not excitement, it was an epoch taking stock. The cosmos requires stories to make sense of itself, and epochs prefer tragic narratives. Beneath the surface of their confrontation, two different visions of transcendence argued with blood and doctrine, neither intended to yield. Behind every attack each planned, there were syllogisms. Gorr's first strike would be accusation, Darkseid's rebuttal would be annihilation. The terms could not be reconciled at an argument table. They required the theater of combat to decide. And so, silent as a verdict and inevitable as death, they approached, carrying the weight of their philosophies like armor. The cosmos, having summoned its jurors, leaned forward to witness whether justice would be redefined by a butcher of divinities or by a tyrant who sought to make order the final god. The clash began without drums, a violence that read like a finished argument. Gorr struck first, arrays of shadow blades ripping at Darkseid's armor, each blow an accusation meant to strip the idea of God down to bone. The Necrosword's hunger reached for the mythology around Darkseid, trying to devour the stories that lent him status. Darkseid answered with machines of light, Omega beams that did not merely burn but rearranged the grammar of attack, turning Gorr's absence into a subject that could be legislated. Gorr's movements were the geometry of vengeance. Each swing of all black took narrative and fed it back into the blade. Every god-slain memory was fuel. He did not aim to destroy flesh first, but to excise meaning. Darkseid did not meet him as a man, but as an institution enforcing its own axioms. The Omega beams folded space to restrain the Necrosword's reach, and the battlefield became a courtroom with no bail. Gorr summoned altars of shadow, whole chapels of absence calling out the names of the Forsaken. Shades he had made rose like witnesses, giving oath. For a moment they swarmed Darkseid, and for a moment their testimony shook the field. Darkseid watched and rewrote their claims into precedent. He did not merely silence ghosts, he turned their accusations into new instruments of control. When Darkseid used the Omega Sanction, it was a verdict rendered in fire. Gorr saw infinite corridors of alternate existences, where his victories were reversed and his triumphs became slow erasures. The Sanction was not immediate death, but systematic unmaking of certainty. Gorr tore at it with the same stubbornness he used to tear faith from temples, and the Necrosword tried to consume the Sanction's edges. For a breath the two forces tangled like rival laws, the Necrosword's negation scratching at the Omega's iron logic. Gorr attempted a larger strategy. He pulled at faith nodes across systems, severing the tenuous threads that tied worship to divinity. Where he cut, minor gods staggered and their power bled into all black. The Butcher's plan was to swell into a problem Darkseid could not legislate away. Darkseid countered with scale. He did not simply patch worship, he reorganized it, converting fear into predictable ritual and turning that predictability into another kind of feedstock. The more Gorr exposed corruption and impotence, the more Darkseid quantified those exposures and wove them into new structures of obedience. The fight narrowed into a grim calculus. Gorr's offensives were propositions. Darkseid's replies were proofs that closed the space of possible outcomes. All black could devour essence, but Darkseid's essence was not a single thread. It was governance woven into physics. Gorr eloped at strands and found they rerouted, re-entering the world as ballast for the Omega. Each tragic act fed a clause in Darkseid's architecture. At the climax, Gorr detonated a god bomb, a bloom of pure negation designed to excise Apokolips's concept from history. The blossom of non-existence swallowed light and threatened to make the argument absolute. For a heartbeat, the universe held its breath. Here was pure counterexample, the radical negation that would prove Gorr's thesis by annihilation. Darkseid did not recoil. He stepped into the more like a jurist entering his own tribunal. The Omega beams did not merely resist the bomb, they translated its erasure into precedent, folding the bomb's annihilative logic into an eternal admonition that would instruct rather than simply erase. Gorr's scream was the sound of purpose hitting an immovable proof. The Necrosword's appetite crashed against a system capable of absorbing appetite and turning hunger into order. The more he lacerated the cosmos, the more raw material he provided Darkseid to entrench the very order he opposed. Each act of exposing godly hypocrisy became a clause in a new statute. In attempting to unmake Darkseid's idea, Gorr had fed the mechanisms that made Darkseid unkillable. The final act was not a triumphant slaughter but adjudication. The Omega Sanction, precise and inexorable, folded Gorr into sequences of lives where his crusade unraveled into quiet despair, existences where his violence meant little and his name barely echoed. It was a punishment fashioned as pedagogy, to erase not only the Butcher's body but the certainties that birthed his frenzy. When the final sheet of silence fell, Darkseid remained standing. He had not been proven benevolent, he had been proven survivable. The cosmos, practical and weary, rearranged toward the model that promised predictable survival, choosing the lesser chaos of an enforced order over the liberating chaos that might cannibalize its caretakers. Gorr's questions lingered like afterimages, morally potent, impossible to fully extinguish, but insufficient to topple a mechanism that could translate dissent into doctrine. The Butcher had forced truths into the light. Gods could be corrupt and unanswerable. Worship could calcify into cruelty. The Tyrant had built statutes around those truths. One offered exposure and retribution, the other promised enforceable consequence. The winner was decided not only by blades or beams, but by which philosophy could better survive the universe's indifference. Darkseid's governance, brutal and absolute, endured. Gorrin's fire had burned fierce, but it was subsumed into a lesson that tightened the order it sought to fracture. In that strange, terrible way, Darkseid's victory was the verdict the cosmos could use to sleep at night.